All right, guys. So today it's just me. Maybe people will join in. We will see. But I figured I'll just go over some of the topics. And one of these topics, maybe a little demo I had in mind for Elsa 3. Maybe something cool. We can talk a little bit about Elsa 3.0. We can talk about Elsa 3 progress and about the steering committee elections candidacy. Let's start with that. Christina, you joined. Chris, welcome. So let's see if this works. But thank you for joining. So let's see if I can get rid of this. Don't know how, but that's okay. So as I was saying, yeah, I wanted to look at the steering committee candidates. We have 1, 2, Jay, Modali, Mohammed, I think. Yeah, Mohammed, Matthias, Gurkan, Christina, and Tomislav, also known as Toby. So that's 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7 candidates, which is pretty awesome. So I was thinking to give this 2 weeks. So we started the election, the candidacy last week. So this is then now we are 1 week ahead. So next meeting we will see how many candidates we have, and then maybe that's the point where we decide what the election procedure would be. So I was thinking maybe everyone who wants to vote gets 1 vote, and they can cast their vote on one of their favorite candidates, and then this election procedure would then take maybe a week or maybe 2 weeks. We can decide on that. But what we need is somebody who isn't part of the voting process, so none of the candidates, but somebody from the community that is objective, who receives the votes, because I think we will want people to be able to vote anonymously. So maybe we set up some, yeah, exactly. So maybe we set up some Google form, and then we have a secretary who handles that, and then we count the votes. So that will be phase 1 of the election, and there will be a second phase, and that's between the 5 steering committee members who will receive the most votes. Between them, we should then elect benevolent dictator. And this again, this will be up to the community members who want to vote. They can choose who should be the benevolent dictator. So let's say next week, close candidacy, and start voting process. I just received a message from Gurkan. He wants to join as well, but he's still on the phone. All right, so status. You will be happy to see that I have a couple of issues created for Elsa 3 specifically. There's a new projects beta. It's been out for a while, but I'm still experimenting with it. So this board contains some sort of backlog for Elsa 3 specific items, stuff that I know we will want to do for sure. So some of these are designer specific. Actually, most of them are, but some of them are things like the HTTP endpoint activity. We have it in Elsa 3, but it's very bare bones. For example, if we look at the current implementation, it allows the user to select the supported methods to check. So this is the default value, but it can support multiple in, I think, the middleware for the method. Right, yeah, and we should maybe extend this. Can be extended, of course, and we could even consider making this configurable from the application points of view. Some people may want to use more verbs, others may not want to use anything at all, or allow the user to change this programmatically, like we can do in Elsa 2, where you can implement a handler that overrides the property descriptor with completely custom values. Could be custom UI hint, could be different options. None of that exists in Elsa 3, but that will be a feature to add as well. So it's one example that needs to be extended. Another thing is actually reading the content. I don't think we are doing it right now. And not only that, there's also it's the reading of the content that's been posted, but then also being able to parse it into JSON objects or strongly typed .NET objects, that sort of thing. So that's basically what this ticket is about. It was just there. Oh, here it is, complete HTTP endpoint. Yeah, I didn't add too many details yet, but I've been basically scaffolding some of these sets. Another one is, say, a toolbar. Maybe we want to have a toolbar. So at the top of the designer could contain buttons like auto layout. So right now you can manually drag and drop the activities, but maybe you want to have, if you make a mess, then you want to automatically lay it out, which is a feature we need in any case for workflows that have been programmed using C#, for which we don't have positional information, right? We don't have X and Y coordinates when you create something in C# like this. Take one example, right? So here we want the workflow to be rendered in the designer, so it should have a two write line activities. We don't have any positional information, so we should render these two nodes on the display, and then some. Right now it doesn't, so this is not supported. So this cannot currently be loaded onto the designer. And the way this works in Elsa 2 is we have different sources of workflow blueprints, and one such source is a workflow definition, which is a database record created by the designer. So the designer invokes an API endpoint. That endpoint creates a workflow definition based on the posted JSON created by this designer. And then in order to make it available to the workflow engine, these workflow definitions are transformed into a thing called workflow blueprints. And the same goes for these sort of workflows that are created using C# code. They are a different source that are also turned into a workflow blueprint. So you have two kinds of source models, basically, and they are mapped to a workflow blueprint, and that gets executed by the engine. This mapping from code to a workflow blueprint that works in Elsa 2 and Elsa 3, it works a little bit differently. Here the engine works with iActivities, and as you can see, this bit of C# code creates this structure directly, so there's no additional mapping. But still, in order to make it available to the designer, we need to expose some endpoint that can transform such a workflow into a bit of JSON that is then understood by the designer. That's another thing that needs to be added. Maybe I should create a quick note about that. So the initial layout could be done using an algorithm like Dagger or some tree layout, some simple algorithm. And then the user will be able to drag them around. And then this additional data would be stored separate, of course, from the C# code, because we can't be updating this. Technically, it's probably possible, but it would probably make more sense to store this as some sort of metadata in some database table or some storage. And then the next time the user opens the designer, then it retains that information, that positional information. That's great. Yeah, I think we should do that. So this Elsa 3 thing, it has a service that can turn the workflow that we have here, the structure, into an actual hierarchical tree view shape. And there's then a walker that walks this tree and then assigns unique identifiers to each of them. So as long as you don't change the structure of the workflow, then the naming should be the same. I'm doubting myself now because I'm not sure if I recall generating unique identifiers, because then that's useless. But if it uses a predeterministic algorithm by using, for example, for1 for this one, because it's the first four and then sequence one, etc., then we could use that name. Yeah, we can figure something out. And then as long as the workflow isn't changed, then the name will be deterministic, and that could then be bound to the positional information. Yeah. And worst case, the user does change the workflow. It's no biggie. It will just auto layout that thing, and you can always correct it yourself in the designer. Yeah, so I will turn these into issues later. Just making quick notes. Yeah, so this is for one example of a toolbar. So there's a lot of little things to do. Automatic layout, sub actions need to be implemented. So what are sub actions? That's this little button here. These are inactive publish words, but the rest aren't implemented. It's little nice details, I think, that can be easily picked up by anyone who's interested. There's also activities themselves. For example, the break activity is lacking in Elsa 3 still. And the break activity is important to be able to break out of a loop, which could be a while loop, could be ForEach, could be for, maybe other looping constructs. This enables the user to break out of loop once a certain condition is met. Yeah, so both in Elsa 2 and in Elsa 3, you will be able to loop back using by connecting these nodes. So then you have let's say a natural loop. But in Elsa 3, you will have the same structure as in Elsa 2, and let me just show you. For example, here we have a for each, and it's nice, I think, when using the C# language to define your workflow. So here we start with a write line, then a for each, and then you can specify the body of this for each, which could be another sequence, could be a flowchart, could be a single activity as is shown here. And it's from this point of view, it's very convenient to do it this way, because otherwise, if you wanted to create this loop by connecting back to the for each, what you would have to do is then you would first have to define the for each as a variable, as an example. And then, of course, you can add it to your sequence here. And then at some point in the sequence, you want to do some stuff. So let's say for body is some sequence. And now let's say we have a whole bunch of activities here. And one of these activities, now you want to basically connect back to your for each from within. your loop. It would work, but from C Sharp's perspective, yes. But I understand what you're saying. From the designer point of view, it's a different story. Because now, if you imagine what this would look like from the designer, it kind of depends how you visualize it, I think. If you visualize it like Windows Workflow Foundation, I don't know, version 3 or so, where you don't have the flow chart, but you have these blocks. So and they are little cells, so then you can put this right line, for example, in a nested cell, or if it would be nested within the for each, so then visually it would make more sense. But from when you look at a flowchart model, I agree it can be confusing. Probably we can come up with something that the designer understands this for the for each activity, where you would still have an outcome of, well, so it would have an iterate, I think it's called. This for each activity has a body, it's an outbound. I actually don't know if I already implemented this. But my thinking was this would show up as a port on the activity in the designer. Wait, let me see if I can just show. All right, so here we have a for each, and then see if it shows the. It doesn't currently show the label of the output, but this would then be the body basically. This needs to be enhanced because I'm not sure if this is the body or if it received an automatic done outcome because this is thing that we're designing right now is actually a flowchart activity, and it does some special thing to allow you to connect arbitrary nodes to one another, but also mixing with, for example, this if has a then and an else, and this is a similar construct. So if we go to this if activity has a then property and an else property. So this is the true branch and the false branch. But as you can see, from a code point of view, you just pop in some activity to execute, which again could be a flowchart, could be another if, could be a sequence. And based on these names, it renders these outputs. And the flowchart designer allows you to assign basically this activity to this property here. So it's a little process called transposition or something. But yeah, my main point, or the point I'm trying to make, is we can probably come up with something nice so that with a for each, if we think that we want to do it like that, we can just have it hook back, or maybe add an inbound port so that you have a clear visual hint to close the loop, basically. Yeah, we can think about this for a nice way. And by the way, currently all of these activities look the same, but we can customize the look for each activity individually, which I think I want to do for things like if, but also the flowchart. This, of course, isn't a good flowchart. Maybe it should use some icon that more reflects a flowchart. And then you should be able to double click. A new tab would be opened within the designer that allows you to basically drill into your workflow. Bottom line, lots of work to do. So let me see. So let's imagine that we don't have this one, but we have it for it. So let's imagine this is the body. And then we have a bunch of activities. So from right line to this one, to this one. And now let's say here we want to add a break. So imagine here's another outcome. So this would be the iterate or the body port, and there will be a done. So that would mean indeed, as soon as it encounters a break, it will not continue the remainder of the body of the for each, but it would then execute whatever is connected to the done port that we don't see right now. I think that will be more natural and more flexible because you can have multiple conditions at certain points in your process, at which point you may want to break the loop, versus if you have a separate socket or an out port for break where you can then add a condition, could work, but then it may be a little bit too limited in terms of under which circumstances you want to break the loop. So in essence, visually it would look the same as in Elsa 2, which also means you have some branch hanging out of the for each that represents your for each loop, and then a done outcome to continue after the for each finishes. We could also come up with a visualization where these activities become nested within your for each. So maybe we require the user to expand the for each, and then this thing becomes a big box. And then within that box, you have like a mini workflow. Could be a sequence, could be a single activity, or it could be a flowchart that you drop into it, and then you have a little flowchart designer within your for each. That's entirely possible as well. Do you happen to have an example? Yeah, that would be good for inspiration, if nothing else. Yeah, so the break activity. RunAt is a timer activity. It's similar to, well, it's not similar to delay. Let me rephrase that. It is similar to delay, but here you specify an explicit time in the future at which this activity should trigger the workflow. In Elsa 2, it's called start at. Here it's called RunAt. And it's an arbitrary name change. Probably we should use the same, unless enough people think RunAt is a nicer name than start at. Probably we should keep it as start at, but that needs to be implemented. Same goes for fitness, and this entire lane will grow over the next few days and weeks with little tasks. Some are little, some are bigger. It will give hopefully a good overview of what remains to be done for Elsa 3 preview 1. The reason for the RunAt activity to be there is when, imagine you have a workflow and at some point it gets suspended on this run or blocked by this RunAt activity, and you want to run it 5 hours from now, but just once. And a cron, in my mind at least, represents something that can be recurring, unless it's generally a valid use for cron activities to also just be one-off events. Then maybe you're right, but would it also allow you to specify a specific timestamp in the future with cron? So a cron activity would allow you to specify a date and the time up to the second and maybe even millisecond, although that's probably not as. Maybe we can think of through some of the use cases for cron and RunAt, see because if they all match up, then we can get rid of the RunAt maybe and make it just use the cron activity, because it would also can execute once. Fitness activity allows the workflow to stop immediately. That's one that needs to be done. Notifications UI. So that would maybe look something or similar to what the Azure portal has. So some icon here that you can always invoke to see what were the recent notifications. I thought maybe that's nice, because right now there's nothing. As with any issues, any suggestions are welcome, but this was my initial idea. I noticed we are very close to the end time. I did want to give a little demo of something geeky. It's a DSL for Elsa 3, and pull it up here. And this DSL, what allows that the user to do is to have an alternative to visual workflows and C# code to model a workflow, but using a domain-specific language that hopefully makes it a little bit easier to define workflows. For some users, it will be useless because they need visual diagrams. Others prefer to just use C#, which gives you intelligence and it gives you syntax coloring. But another set of users, it may be useful if you need the ability to have workflows that you want to write, but have them stored as files or maybe in a database, maybe generate them dynamically. And then the DSL could be nice. I want to go through a few examples just to show what you could do with it potentially. The first sample here is a workflow that has just one activity. It's the write line activity. And it uses a syntax that's similar to JSON, where you can configure each property with a value. And the value could be a literal, as is seen here, but it could also be an expression. So it could be a JavaScript expression, so that you can assign values dynamically. So let's just run this first, just to prove that it works. And this works. Of course, very simple. In reality, you will have a bit more complicated workflows. But before I want to show that, I also want to show something else related. So here, this is the same workflow, but this time I'm using a function called print. And I think the cool thing about that is that you can define your own functions to, create your own vocabulary, map your functions to activities. So here I defined a print function, mapped it to the write line activity, and then you specify the property names that you want to be able to map to the arguments of the function. And this is position based. So the first, and in this case, the only argument is the text property of the write line. So that means this argument gets mapped to the text property of the write line activity. Here I have another one, read, which we'll see in a second as well. This works too, just to run it quickly. So here again, prints hello world. Here's a more complicated workflow, because usually you will have constructs like ForEach and if, and in this case a sequence, and that's supported too. So you can add multiple activities in the form of an array like this, and then it will just go from, it will execute sequence, which in turn will schedule the write line activity, the read line activity assigned to a variable here, so you can reference it later. For example, here, imagine the user is prompted to enter their name. Then the read line activity allows the user to input their name through the console. And then you want to echo back that name using a JavaScript expression, and you could do it like so. But with the caveat that this does not currently work. This is not yet implemented. So here's a demo that actually does allow you to do this. Actually, this is not a good example. This would be better, but we'll get to that in a second. This is just relying on the functions, and this syntax here, being able to declare a workflow variable, is what's missing in demo 3a. Here, there's no way to tell the interpreter that I want to define a workflow variable, or even use this output of this readline because it has a return value that could then be used here. There's nothing for that. That's yet to be designed as part of the language. But for in this mode, where I use the variable definition here, I can do the following. Here I'm using the print function that's been mapped to the writeline activity, then execute read. And the nice thing here is that because this is mapped to the readline activity, which has a return value, this syntax will then assign that value to the name workflow variable, which then can be used here. I was very close to finishing this, but I just didn't make it in time. But let me show you the demo 3b. As you saw, as for my name, I entered, well, not my name, but it still works. Hello Jack was echoed back. And small detail here, this was evaluated at runtime when it executed a writeline using the JavaScript interpreter. So this is important. This allows you to specify the syntax. So this is JavaScript. Could be any feature language that Elsa supports, including Liquid, maybe Python, maybe even C# in the future, or maybe an Elsa-based expression that could be based on JavaScript. I considered it, but ultimately it's probably just going to be very similar to JavaScript, so maybe JavaScript makes the most sense. And of course, these were very simple workflows. But what I think would be nice, and in fact, in this case it works, is to be able to map keywords to activities so that instead of having to create your workflow model structure through, for example, C#, like what we have. For example, here, there's a conditional workflow, allows you to just create a sequence that executes a couple of activities, and then an if condition. And for the if activity, and then you specify the condition, the then branch, and the else branch. And it works, and I think it's decent. Wouldn't it be cool if you can use something like this, where you actually have keywords, where you can use a programming language that looks like JavaScript, looks like C#, but it's actually a workflow. And then you can have things like, well, these are of course short-lived functions, but let's say now I want to wait for user approval. This could be you wouldn't even have to use a wait, just user approval. This will be an activity that you configure with anything you need. Could be a user ID, could be many more properties you need. And this way, have a more, well, to developers it would be more natural, not to end users. For end users, this would not be suitable, I imagine. But this thing works. So if we go from top to bottom, we again print out a prompt. We store the readline result into a workflow variable. Then we enter some if statement. And then if this condition is met, it performs these two statements. If not, it performs this statement. And then finally, an end statement, just to show that this one works as well. So let's enter 12. And when you're 12, you're too young to drive a car. So you need to use a bicycle. And of course, we can try another value. And now the other branch is executed. But again, I think for some users it's useful. For many users, maybe not. A couple of big disadvantages, of course, is you don't have color syntax highlighting. It could be added. You probably also need some proper debugging support. It could be added in the future, but seems complicated to me to do it in the short run. But it's a bit of a side project that I've been working on. Just for the final kick is to show that this language, it's actually turned into a workflow definition. So here we have this script that I loaded in, which we just looked at. That's demo 4, this bunch. And then here we have the workflow definition. It took the script, pushed it through the DSL engine, and then we have a root sequence. Its activities, writeline, readline, etc. The if and the else branch and the then branch itself is a sequence of 2 activities. But that concludes this little demo. Thank you. All right, then I think it's really time to close off. All right, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.